They sent us proof, not prophecy. Look at this. They stripped planets down to the crust. The voice came from beneath the concrete shelter, buried deep under Zurich's decommissioned metro grid. General Athar Malik, chief of Earth's interstellar recon, slammed his palm on the steel table, jolting the delegates around him. The image projected from the heads-up display flickered, revealing what once was the surface of Venthera Prime. A grid of gouged-out quarries, flaked with reactor waste, lifeless and veined in slag. No one spoke. Not the Russian admiral hunched over his thermos. Not the African Union's defense minister, who hadn't blinked in a minute. Not even the U.S. envoy, whose tie was still askew from the scramble to reach the bunker. They did this in under 3 days, Malik continued, dragging his finger across coordinates and thermal overlays. And now we've got Harach probes pinging Saturn's moons. We know what comes next. From the back of the room, a low voice cut through. You don't win against that with missiles. You choke them off from the inside. All heads turned. Commander Marcus Van stepped forward, pulling up a second set of visuals. A schematic of Earth's asteroid belt transport network, laid over outdated Harach propulsion signatures. He was lean, broad-shouldered, with graying temples and the kind of stillness that made men around him fidget. His old mining uniform was scuffed, patched with decades of wear. The scars on his hands told more than any ribbon could. Malik narrowed his eyes. You've been quiet for 4 briefings. I speak when I have a plan, Van said coldly. And now I have one. He tapped the display. We've got Harach wreckage from that skirmish near Vega. Barely functional, but it's enough. We've reverse-engineered a fragment of their signal modulation. We mask our fleet, ride between their scans, and starve their convoys once they anchor. The Australian liaison leaned forward, skeptical. You're proposing we engage a civilization that's dismantled 8 empires using recycled alien junk and smuggled code snippets? No, Van replied, eyes fixed on the map. I'm proposing we make them bleed logistics before they even see a barrel pointed their way. 48 hours later, every orbital camera above Earth blacked out for 3 full minutes. When they blinked back online, the Harach were here. Dozens of oblong vessels, carved like obsidian teeth, hung above the equator line. They did not move. They did not signal. They simply blocked out the stars. On a rooftop near Lahoe's southern district, a school janitor dropped his mop when the sky turned the color of soot. In Cairo, car alarms went off from the sheer electromagnetic distortion pressing down from orbit. On a back road in Wyoming, a farmhand stopped mid-swing with his axe, watching the air shimmer like stretched plastic above the hills. And in a chamber beneath the Rockies, Commander Van stared at the distorted patterns flickering across his display. They've established a hard-wall perimeter, said Lieutenant Rundahl, one of Van's signal analysts. Sensor bleed covers 92% of low orbit, and they're not masking it. They're daring us to notice. Let them. Van's voice carried a jagged calm. Pull surveillance back from all mining belts. Redirect cloaked drones to feed mirrored relay signals. Sir, they think we're reading their grid. I want them reading ours. On Earth's official frequencies, the Harach sent one message. It arrived in 137 languages simultaneously, encoded in vibrations that bypassed satellites and rang through tectonic plates themselves. Phones, tunnel walls, radio towers, even the floors of submarines, quavered with a single unified transmission. Your silence will not delay judgment. Surrender your iridium reserves. Resistance ensures removal. No mention of negotiations, no overt threats. Just that calm, glacial phrasing, spoken through a translator's deadpan cadence. The United Assembly met 12 hours later. Official response? Earth acknowledges receipt. Further assessment underway. No bravado, no defiance, just enough uncertainty to stall and buy time. Van stood beside the inner walls of the Geneva Assembly's war annex, watching the politicians cycle through wordsmithing like it might block orbital fire. One advisor muttered something about drafting an appeasement clause. Van didn't even blink. "They're already mining near Mongolia," he said quietly to Rundal, who stood beside him. "Check seismic reports from the Irkutsk region. They're building temporary siphons." Rune tapped his control deck, filtering feeds. "Confirmed. We've got unregistered heat blooms cutting through permafrost. Ground scans suggest 4 Harach diggers already operating. Iridium cores are being extracted directly. And we haven't fired. Not yet." Van walked away without another word. Diplomacy was still being tried. He had work to do beneath it. He arrived at the subterranean grid in Kazakhstan's northeastern basin, one of the oldest asteroid trade transit labs still operating in blackout mode. The facility buzzed with sleepless engineers patching cables, translating code lines scraped from broken Harach beacons. Van approached a technician soldering a neural interface loop to a half-melted alien circuit. "How many systems have we synced?" The tech glanced up, blinking through fatigue. "Only 2 fully. Partial compatibility's rising though, still waiting on stabilizers from the Penumbra stockpile." "Good. Bring everything online, and load the Vanguard cloaks. We'll test them in the Ceres corridor by dawn." As he turned to leave, the technician called out, "Commander, what if we fail?" Van paused at the door. "Then make sure they never get to write the history." From orbit, the Harach fleet shifted its outer ring, casting an elliptical shadow across the Pacific and stretching over the southern edge of Asia. Commercial satellites snapped images every 5 seconds. None showed sunlight reaching the ground beneath the cloud of ships. Night fell where noon should have stood. Children cried in underground shelters. Crowds in bunkers whispered prayers. Pilots gripped armrests in silence, their jets grounded by no-fly directives. In a dim hangar beneath Mount Tenron, Commander Van locked eyes with his lieutenants. "Let the world think we're hiding," he said. "We are, in plain sight. Let them believe we're broken. Let them press deeper. Every inch they take will cost them." Outside, the stars were gone. The Harach had come, and Earth had not answered. Yet, they've started pulling our sky apart. Van didn't raise his voice as the data scrolled across the reinforced screens around him. Thermal maps showing new surface fractures in the Siberian permafrost, deep core shocks beneath the Andes, pulsed energy strikes along the Congo fault line. Harach deployment patterns weren't exploratory anymore. They were stripping the crust in layers, one vector at a time. "They're not searching," Lieutenant Rundal said from across the comm station. "They're harvesting. And they're doing it with surgical timing," Van replied, tapping his boot once against the steel floor. 30-second windows between ground strike and resource extraction. They're not worried about defense. They think we're still arguing over whose airspace they violated. The room around them, an abandoned hydroelectric control center, had been repurposed into a tactical node. Steel cables ran across the floor, draped over old turbine engines now converted into data routers. Dust coated everything. It stuck to your tongue. It stung when you breathed. The only clean thing here was the intent. Behind Van, a group of engineers calibrated a tracking pod scavenged from a destroyed Harach scout drone. It was small enough to carry in 2 hands, its inner systems still glowing faintly under human wiring. A single solder joint smoked as a tech sealed the bypass, an unnatural hiss, thick and oily. "You've got 18 minutes, Van told them. "Then we test this on the Eurasia loop. Either it jumps the signal or it detonates. Either way, we learn." The technician didn't look up. "It's my brother's city they flattened last night. I'd rather it detonates." Public broadcasts across Earth stayed on loop. Weather updates, cultural documentaries, old sporting events re-syndicated to drown out panic. Every major government claimed joint coordination. None admitted paralysis. Meanwhile, entire blocks of infrastructure fell dark, one after the other. Bogota lost its northeast district when a high-altitude burst shattered its substation cores. In Irkutsk, the ground split open with a noise like tearing bone as Harach drills vaporized a granite ridge beneath civilian housing. The Congo pipeline went silent as skirmish drones blotted out the cloud layer and began pulling core traces without engagement. The media called it targeted interference. The truth had already slipped underground. At Site Theta, tucked beneath Greenland's ancient radar basin, Van stood in front of a cracked window pane, watching snow melt in irregular bursts. Buried somewhere beyond that storm was a mining cluster that hadn't transmitted in 6 hours. A man approached, younger, leaner, hands blackened with carbon sealant, one of the newer engineers. He carried a folder in one hand, not a tablet. Old school. We've stabilized 2 pulse relays, short range, nothing orbital, but it's enough for low-pass interference. Van scanned the handwritten notes, then tossed the folder onto the table beside him. You volunteered for this unit. My father was at the iridium plant in Alberta. The man didn't blink. He's not accounted for. Van turned. This isn't about revenge. It never is. This is about denial. We don't defeat them. We break the timing of their systems. One bad signal, one corrupted scan. That's what slows them. The man nodded, stepped back, and returned to his rig. No salute, no flare, just movement. Stage Ember is go. The message arrived via direct line pulse to Van's portable drive, a crude, secure method. He read the 4-line directive in silence. No elaboration, no room for missteps. It meant the plan was alive now. Controlled leaks would suggest Earth's power centers had fractured. Faked retreats would imply Earth was trying to conserve dwindling weaponry. Sabotage would be dressed as failure. Public confusion would be weaponized. He briefed his team in the command cavern beneath Mongolia's eastern ridge, one of the only natural choke points not yet hit. Stage Ember isn't a counterstrike, he began. It's a disguise. We want them looking left while we pull the floor from under them. His hand hovered above a series of red-flagged terminals. Unit 7, drop the feed on the European grid, make it look like system overload. Unit 9, load our reactor flare pattern into the automated factories. They'll think we're funneling raw ore, not hiding prototype cloaks. Lieutenant Vaughn, he continued, pointing across the room. You've got the bleed signal pattern. Upload it through the Sahara relay, not the Arctic. The moment they believe we're routing power through the southern corridors, they'll stretch their sensor lines, and that's when we drop them. One of the younger officers raised his hand. Sir, what if they don't move to intercept? What if they just burn it all? Van stepped down from the platform. His boots echoed off the concrete with finality. Then we take it personal. Outside the Kazakhstan base, dusk hung like ash. Harach units had landed beyond the ridgeline earlier that week, and though they hadn't pushed forward since, their perimeter glowed with flickers of unspoken threat. Watching without motion, waiting without noise. Inside, the engineers initiated the test. The cloaked relay blinked once, its interface flickering through 8 unauthorized spectrums before settling. A signal ping returned. Not from Earth. Not from human code. The room tensed. It bit, one tech whispered. We hooked into their sensor web. It thinks we're a feeder node. Shunt the signal east, Van ordered immediately. Bounce it between old comms towers, slow rotation. If they triangulate, they'll hit a dead sector. The power flickered, then fell. Emergency lights didn't kick in. For 6 full seconds, the entire facility was blind. Darkness crept into every seam. No buzz, no static, no digital flickers. Just the brutal absence of presence. Then the outer walls pulsed with impact. Low, blunt, and distant. The Harach camp outside had blacked out too. Did we just short their grid? Rundal muttered. Van watched the systems come back online, one dial at a time. No, he said, we let them taste chaos. And the taste, he knew, would make them paranoid. Scramble them now. If we wait another second, that convoy's ash. Colonel Tyvan Dross leaned over a cracked map board pinned with real-time sensor feeds stitched from 20 obsolete satellites and 7 stolen ones. He was built like a slab of rebar, broad, knotted forearms, a half-healed burn curling across his jaw. The room smelled like scorched nylon and concrete dust. Every second the screen flickered was a second someone died on the surface. Lieutenant Harach Vaughn pulled down his headset. His knuckles were raw from clenching too long. I've already redirected the decoy drones. They'll draw fire east. You've got 6 minutes before their targeting realigns. Dross turned without blinking. 6 minutes is enough. The corridor outside shook. One of the storage units had gone up. The shockwave rattled the ceiling fixtures and sent fine grit drifting down like powdered ash. Somewhere deeper in the compound, metal screamed against stone. Vaughn didn't flinch. He kept his fingers moving across the comm board, rerouting frequencies through buried copper lines, and re-linked urban broadcast towers. Most of the lines weren't meant to carry anything heavier than a news signal. Now they carried scrambler pulses, meant to blind Harach targeting systems and corrupt the drones still circling the skies like vultures. The moment we move, Droth growled, they'll scan for density anomalies. They'll expect armor, not civvies with det cord. I want their assumptions punished. Outside the bunker, the civilian-trained strike teams began their rotations. They weren't soldiers. They were ex-engineers, retired miners, burned-out truckers, and tech students who once built RC quadcopters in garages. Now they ran black market explosives into abandoned metro stations, rewired power substations to overload with false signals, and turned sewage lines into drone traps. They worked in silence, moved in pairs, and vanished before their targets fell. In Santiago, a Harach storage depot erupted from beneath. The explosion didn't come from a missile. It came from an electrical fault seeded into the smart metal of the loading tracks. As the top half of the facility buckled into itself, the enemy scrambled for nearby patrols, only to find their drones circling empty intersections preloaded with false thermal signatures. On the outskirts of Irkutsk, a civilian transport truck lit up with magnetic decoys, guiding an entire flight squadron of Harach interceptors off course. By the time they rerouted, the actual resistance teams had siphoned the remaining iridium from under their command post. Every hit left no slogan, no flag, just wreckage and absence. At Site Pharaon, a facility buried under the hollowed-out spine of a derelict rail line, Commander Van studied the decrypted logs fed back from those early strikes. They think we're animals with firecrackers, he muttered. Rundal, squatting beside a damaged transceiver, adjusted a rusted relay with the edge of a multi-tool. They've logged the sabotage as structural instability and labeled our drone hijacks as signal noise. They're writing us off. Then we make that mistake permanent. Van crossed to the staging deck, where a single recon shuttle, human-built, Harach-shielded, sat under blackout tarp. Its cockpit smelled like battery acid and coolant, with makeshift harnesses stitched from parachute straps and shredded crash suits. Lieutenant Vaughn approached, slinging a cable reel over his shoulder. 3 hours to charge. After that, she's flying blind. Good, Van said. We only need her to blink. The plan was surgical. Slip through a soft band in the Harach radar grid where they relied on passive echo sensors. Drop elevation just above the tree line. Navigate using analog gyros, not digital nav. Land near the wreck of a Harach scout vessel shot down in one of the first weeks. Retrieve anything salvageable. Anything they missed, and vanish before someone looked too hard. Dross stood near the hatch, checking the detonator cords in his vest. If this goes wrong, I level the wreck before they sniff it. Van nodded. Nothing leaves their claws twice. The flight in was brutal. Wind shear slammed the shuttle sideways across frozen peaks, The onboard nav kit flickered, stuttering across dead stars and false triangulation points. They flew without telemetry, guided only by sheer instinct and a 6-year-old topographic map etched into Van's memory from his mining days. The wreck lay beneath a sheet of ice, scorched across one side like a cauterized wound. The Harach vessel had long since been cannibalized, its shell cracked, its sensor ports gutted, but deeper inside something still ticked. A core relay, dormant but intact. Vaughn pulled it from the debris with trembling gloves, the housing unit biting into his palms as frost flaked from its edges. The relay blinked once. No alarm, no pulse beacon. They were out in 9 minutes. Back at Farron, the engineers swarmed the relay. Every component was stripped, cataloged, tested, and patched into the human network, feeding directly into Van's sabotage teams. Its algorithms revealed their fleet's heat management patterns, their blind spots when engine cores overloaded, the brief windows when external scans dropped to preserve internal system health. Those windows became doorways. The next night, Dross led a hit on an orbital fuel node via tethered ascent from a weather balloon in Mongolia. The rig was jury-rigged, its lift timing manual, its cables frayed from repeated use. But it reached the node, and Dross planted the charge. From 30 kilometers below, they watched the refueling cradle tear open like a crushed rib cage. Debris burned a trail through the upper atmosphere, streaking green fire into the Pacific. It couldn't last. On the 5th day, a relay signal went dark. Farron's outer perimeter sensors flashed red before anyone saw the sky fall. The first strike broke the ridgeline. The second vaporized the south hangar. The third collapsed the communications wing. Van barely made it out of the side chamber with the jammer core wrapped in thermal cloth. He didn't run. He stalked forward, jaw locked, pulse throbbing, boots dragging sparks from metal stairs as concrete fractured beneath him. A burst of heat burst the side door open. He rolled through it into the snow and came up coughing, ice slicing his throat raw. He didn't look back. That night, from a slope hidden behind a burnt-out ranger station, Van watched a convoy of injured men pulled through broken ice roads by hand. Stretcher frames built from scavenged drone panels, shoulders strained under the weight of wounded legs and singed arms. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained, but they moved with the discipline of survival. Rundal sat beside him, face cut by shrapnel. They think this is the end of the push. They're wrong, Vance said, still staring downhill. This was only the noise before the strike. He didn't blink. He knew what came next. Which one of them do I shoot if they twitch wrong? Tyven Dross didn't lower his weapon as the figures stepped out of the fog. He stood ankle-deep in the shallow marsh surrounding the Black Ridge field lab, eyes narrowed, trigger half-drawn. "They're not, Harach," said Van, his breath clouding in the morning chill. "They're what's left when the Harach are done." 5 Jornath moved cautiously through the frost-wet reeds. Their skin bore the grayish marbling of cryo-scarring, some with limbs misshaped by improper regrowth. Their clothing was stitched from insulation foam and scavenged armor, uneven and patchworked, yet they walked like men who understood death and wanted to return the favor. The lead figure stepped forward and opened his mouth, not to speak, but to let a tiny translator node in his throat carry the words. "We were pilots, navigators, engineers, then slaves. Now we're here to repay what they buried." Van didn't blink. "What do you know about their fleet logic?" The Jornath touched his neck. The war table in the sub-basement hummed with electricity stolen from 6 rerouted city grids. No one was speaking. The Jornath leader, who introduced himself as Celt, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, drawing paths across projected nodes with a battered stylus. "They rely on cohesion, not redundancy," he said. "Every ship acts as a relay for the next. If you interrupt 2 anchors in a sequence, the third will crash data integrity." "Like pulling bricks from a bridge," muttered Rundal, eyes darting between mapped control lines. "Where's the anchor here?" Kelt pointed to a blinking star just above Earth's exosphere. The relay core near Treston Loop. It routes tactical sync between the flanks. If that goes, the whole flank starts guessing, Vaughn finished. They don't guess, Kelt corrected. They collapse. Van stared at the display. You can guide our hackers through their protocol? The Horneth nodded once. But it won't stay stable. They'll adapt. We're not aiming for permanent, Van said. We want chaos. Inside the old hydro substation turned black site server room, Earth's best cyber teams gathered. Former telecom engineers, renegade data farmers, codebreakers once jailed for cracking orbital comms. Now, they were soldiers with keyboards. The screens showed endless lines of alien code. Structured, flowing, recursive. Impossible to brute force. But with Kelt's diagrams and linguistic overlays, they began mapping the translation points, keyframes, and repeat loop handlers. Each node traced led to another subnet, a chain that had to be broken gently. We can't smash through, said Tark, the lead human analyst, but we can feed it poison. The strategy was built around a signal seed, a whisper embedded into distressed beacons. Not human, not Jorneth. Something artificial enough to slip past alien checksum protocols, crafted from patterns copied directly from destroyed Harach vessels. Van called it Ghost Pulse. The plan? Let it pass through their own lines disguised as a rerouted emergency flag. Once inside, the virus would fracture fleet sync, loop their priority orders into nonsense, and force their command tree to fight phantom glitches instead of humans. Think they'll notice the moment it starts? Asked Rune. No, said Kelt. They'll argue about whose fault it is first. Van took the call from Geneva while overlooking a fake evacuation drill staged near the ruins of old Kaliningrad. Hundreds of decoy vehicles drove in staggered formation across cracked roadways. Armored buses filled not with refugees, but crash dummies wrapped in body-warmed insulation to mimic human vitals. Thermal imaging would flag them as civilians. Harach scouts watching from orbit would see disarray, weakness, and when they moved in to intercept, the minefields buried beneath snowbanks would turn the reception into a furnace. On the other end of the call, Earth's defense coordinator kept his tone flat. There's concern over international law. Van didn't look away from the field. There's concern over species extinction too. We'll log your complaint after the war. He ended the call. 3 kilometers away, one of the decoy trucks exploded on cue. A fake distress signal went live immediately, its data tags mimicking the Harach emergency beacon format exactly. The Ghost Pulse was in sight. At the Black Ridge facility, every operative stood still as the data logs began pouring in. One Harach cruiser paused mid-orbit. Its hull lights began blinking erratically, red, then off, then white. A second vessel veered 10 degrees off its patrol route. 2 more hung idle, their relay loops stuttering with inconsistent timestamp responses. Fleet cohesion dropping at nose 3, 7, and 11, said one technician, sweat beading on his forehead. Command handoffs are failing. Bond double-checked the diagnostics. Static interference rising across mid-band relay zones. We're injecting noise into their time flow. They're losing sync. Hold them at edge entropy, Van said. Don't let them crash yet. We want disorder, not disengagement. Confusion is the shield, panic is the sword. Inside the Harach command cruiser orbiting near the equator, conflict bloomed like a sickness. Fleet masters shouted conflicting assessments across the command floor. Systems glitched and reported human movements in areas already sterilized. Internal security teams were dispatched to chase down phantom signals. At one point, they accused each other of withholding data. 3 senior officers were locked out of tactical access. 2 shuttles misfired their own engines trying to reroute around coordinates that no longer existed. Their high commander refused to believe Earth had coordinated this. Their species lacks the scale, he said. This is fault, not strategy. He was wrong. As dusk fell over the steps, Van stood beside Kelt, both of them watching the evening clouds drift across a fractured skyline. The air smelled of copper from the downed pylons, the wind catching torn cables like flags from fallen towers. "You could have left them," Van said. "The others in your fleet." "Why come here?" Kelt didn't answer immediately. He bent, picked up a broken rifle casing, and turned it between his fingers. "Because vengeance is no longer theory," he said. "It's architecture." Far above them, the Harach fleet's central relay buckled under the invisible weight of misalignment. One vessel turned a half-second too soon. Another fired on empty air. A third clipped the atmospheric shell and began spinning into a decaying drift pattern. The fleet's communications, once a chorus of synchronicity, now chattered in fractured tones. Misaligned pulses echoed between ships. The ghost pulse had worked, and the silence was gone. They just fired on their own corvette. Lieutenant Vaughn didn't smile. His eyes tracked the red blip vanishing from the upper radar feed while the entire table fell quiet. Around him, the bunker lights dimmed from overdraw as auxiliary systems rerouted power into uplink scramblers. Everyone had seen the footage. Harach gunships turning on each other mid-formation. Not out of betrayal, but confusion. Controlled destruction had slipped out of their hands. "Is that confirmation?" Van asked, arms folded as he watched the flickering screen. "Ghost Pulse is nested in their command protocol?" Rundal nodded slowly. 4 ships have disengaged without orders. 6 are cross-transmitting with corrupted IDs. Their AI is forcing tactical recalibration loops. They're blind, but they don't know it yet. Van turned toward Dross, who had just entered with his left arm in a sling, flak jacket crusted in dried mud and broken fabric mesh. "Then we move," Van said. "Trigger every static rig across the Atlantic corridor. Tonight, they meet the chaos they wrote off as luck." In Chicago, a derelict power tower lit up as wired pulse bombs activated in sequence, overloading the local grid and frying surveillance satellites in orbit above. The electromagnetic signature mimicked a heat bloom from a railgun battery, an illusion the Harach tactical systems couldn't distinguish from real threat vectors. Aerial drones veered eastward, abandoning positions in South Africa, allowing ground teams to push through decayed checkpoints and collapse a fortified depot near the Somo Range. The strike teams planted collapsible walls packed with sharp matrix foam, which hardened in seconds and blocked the escape routes the enemy had prepared. In Paris, fake convoys broadcast false retreat signals. Harach interceptors pursued and found themselves herded into a corridor packed with motion-triggered flechette pods. 27 of them detonated within 12 seconds. Earth didn't retaliate by marching forward. Earth bled them out by collapsing every tactic they relied on. At the Forward Ops Center in Reykjavik's northern cavern, a stone chamber reconditioned with scavenged fiberboard walls and floors lined in acoustic foam, Van stood over the central table, marking each Harach fallback point with red chalk on a laminated grid overlay. "Urban traps are folding their interior lines," he said. "They're tightening defenses, not expanding. That tells us one thing. They think they're being hunted inside the perimeter," Dross muttered, finishing Van's thought. "We don't need to breach. We need to let them think they already lost the breach." The room trembled faintly. A chain of distant detonations echoed through the earth, too far to damage the command hub, but close enough to rattle dust from the joints. Vaughn leaned in. "They're redirecting orbital fire. Fragmented pulse arrays targeting shadows. They've struck 7 decoy satellites and a civilian hospital already. Nothing coordinated." "That's not panic," said Van. "That's their AI trying to recover." The plan was already in motion. 5 stolen Harach fighters, captured during scattered skirmishes and retrofitted with modified shielding arrays, sat buried beneath the ruins of Manchester's subrail hub. Their power cores had been adapted using Jornath logic patches, giving them just enough data alignment to remain invisible to their own kin. Each craft looked like it belonged above Earth. until it opened fire. Van climbed into the lead cockpit. His helmet locked against the collar seals with a crack. Static scratched at the edge of his hearing as systems came online. The interior smelled of scorched lubricant and stale air. Nothing human had built these controls, yet Van's hands moved over them with certainty. "This won't be clean," came Rundal's voice over the local channel. "They'll recalibrate the second we hit the relay arc." "Then make the first strike count," Van said. "Every second we buy, someone else lives." Above them, the blackout tarp peeled away as solar masking dimmed, revealing the night sky alive with scattered embers. The mission was simple. Fly over what remained of London's central ruins, where the Harach had constructed their relay tower. It now pulsed red, erratic, overloaded, trying to regain control of a fleet that had turned on itself. The goal was to detonate the resonance pods directly into the grid backbone, severing the last vestiges of command unity. Ben didn't look back when they launched. The air screamed across the hull. Harach targeting systems didn't react. Their cloaked allies were visible in the datastream, mistaken for home units. The 5 fighters wove through disrupted weather patterns and collapsed skyline debris, using building shells to mask approach trajectories. Below, a fire flickered where an old government building had been flattened hours earlier. Then the signal came. An open burst from the Harach AI. Command sequence resumed. Alignment pending. Conflict resolved. It had taken back control. Too late. Van's squadron broke formation and dropped to low altitude. The resonance pods deployed. Each one carried phase-shifted charge patterns encoded with the same signal mutations as Ghost Pulse, but tuned to fry whatever systems had survived. The tower sparked once. Then again. Then a third time, as its core relay hissed and belched fluid across its lower bulk. From orbit, the Central Command cruiser, the Dominator, flashed a warning status across every comm band still active. Its central relay loop had gone dark. Back at Reykjavik, operators watched the feed in silence. The Dominator now drifted, not in defeat, but disorientation. Its command lights blinked without rhythm. Its defense turrets began recalibrating without targets. Internal systems failed to hand off duties from core to auxiliary sectors. Tyvendros stepped forward and stared at the blinking red light. Isolated, overloaded, in disarray. "They thought they understood us," Van said beside him. "But they didn't study our minds. They cataloged our tools. That was their mistake. They saw data, not defiance." A long pause. Then Dros asked, "What now?" Van didn't hesitate. "Now we gut their spine. We only get one shot inside that thing," Van said as the strike shuttle rattled beneath their boots. "If they lock the inner hull, we're entombed with the charges." The hold fell silent. 8 men, including Lieutenant Kor Vask, stood shoulder to shoulder in armored stealth suits rigged with dampened thermal plates and field dampeners repurposed from mining stabilizers. Their visors reflected back the shuttle's dim emergency strips, orange against a black that seemed too thick to be sky. Dross passed down satchels of fragmentation gel. 3 pods per man. Set them at the reactor's bleed valves and main coolant forks. No extra, no margin. Kor inspected the cores in silence. He had said little since London. His brother had been in the evacuation convoy, crushed by one of the Dominator's early strafing runs. He never asked for reassignment, never raised his voice. He just showed up every time it counted. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Docking latch in 23 seconds. Entry point. Breach tear on the starboard sensor array. We slipped through the damage they ignored." Van gave no speech. He just locked his visor and stepped forward. The hull breach was jagged. Twisted support beams jutted out like broken ribs, flickering from contact with Earth's weaponized residue. Their boots crunched over powdery slag, the deck beneath still warm from residual discharge. One step inside, and the air shifted. Too dry, thick with the scent of stale organic coolant and the burnt rubber tang of dying circuits. The Dominator didn't look like a ship inside. It looked like something grown. Fibrous conduits ran along the walls, pulsing faintly beneath translucent membranes. Some cables twitched like veins struggling to find rhythm. Panels flickered in mismatched patterns, their code stripped of cohesion. The lights didn't blink in cadence, they glitched in random stutters, making it impossible to settle on any single sense of direction. Core whispered through comms. Feels like walking through an open wound. Stay focused, Van replied. AI's blind but not deaf. They moved fast, hugging corridor edges, deploying signal masking nodes every 20 meters to bend their profiles against internal sensors. The reactor wing sat beneath 3 subchambers, all of them once guarded by neural sentries. Now only 2 remained active, according to their scans. That didn't make it safe. At Junction 3 they hit resistance. A single security drone drifted toward the team, its shell scorched, rotating erratically. It hadn't locked on yet, but its pulse feed had begun to spool up. Core didn't wait. He stepped forward, drew a zero-noise magnetic spike from his belt, and drove it into the drone's lower intake. The impact discharged with a hiss of static and black spray. The drone collapsed in a clatter of broken limbs. Van checked his chronometer. 12 minutes to overload cycle. The next corridor had partially collapsed. Chunks of the ceiling hung by sinewed conduit ropes, swaying slightly. The team ducked beneath the rubble, boots sliding over a floor soaked in coolant runoff. When they reached the first reactor gate, the chamber yawned wide, a sunken core surrounded by 5 exhaust limbs, each venting slow waves of dying heat. The coolant lines hissed and buckled under the strain of automated self-repair. The reactor hadn't shut down, but it was choking on its own damage. Hyven Dross pulled the first satchel from his back. We bury this here, and the ship doesn't reboot, ever. The second gate proved harder. A stealth sentry emerged from the ceiling, not visible until its camo netting failed during movement. The machine dropped without warning, blades extended, optic lights flickering between modes. Air in London. Core shoved the tech beside him out of the way and tackled the drone mid-charge. Both went down hard. The machine twisted, its appendages whirring. Core stabbed twice, once into its midframe, once into its optic stalk, before the drone buried a claw in his flank. The strike team opened fire, filling the corridor with thermal scatter. Sparks rained down. The drone shattered. But Core was already bleeding. Leave me, he managed through clenched teeth, pressing his gloved hand to the wound. You're walking, Van said. No one's dying in a hallway. I won't make it through the climb back. Van locked eyes with him. Core didn't beg. He just handed his detonation trigger to the nearest soldier and turned toward the rear corridor. I'll buy you 20 seconds. Make sure it counts. No one argued. They left him there. The team planted the final charges at the main coolant nexus. The heat inside that chamber distorted vision, sweat pouring beneath their suits despite the internal gel linings. Each satchel was magnetized into structural anchor points, no beeping countdowns, just a chain signal that would sync once the team reached minimum safe distance. They climbed through a maintenance vent to avoid the burned-out drone patrols, navigating blindly in pitch-dark crawl spaces slick with condensation and lined with dormant servos. The exfiltration point, through a maintenance lock near the dorsal core, was only barely wide enough to permit the escape craft's docking claws. By the time they reached the outer hull, the ship had begun to groan. Deep inside, structural plates grinding against each other under artificial gravity shifts. It wasn't aware of what had happened, not fully, but the system knew something was wrong. The shuttle was waiting, half hidden behind a debris ring. Dross helped the last 2 men aboard. Van turned once toward the ship. No one saw Core again. The charges triggered as the shuttle punched out of the lock and angled down. The reactor chamber didn't explode in a flash. It imploded. The vent lines compressed, twisted in on themselves and detonated in a chain so violent it tore the ship's rear third apart. One of the dorsal limbs shattered, spinning loose into open orbit. The Dominator's spine fractured. Data feeds collapsed, comms dropped into corrupted echoes. The flagship didn't just go silent, it lost its shape. What remained drifted sideways, venting coolant like arterial spray across a widening field of debris. Inside the shuttle, no one spoke. Van sat motionless, visor cracked along the side. "He knew he wouldn't make it," said Dross. Van replied, "That's why he went first." They watched the glow of the ship fade into cold shadow. And Earth had just crippled its executioner. They're breaking formation, all of them. Rundahl's voice cracked over the static-choked comms channel as satellite visuals streamed across the control station. The Harach fleet, once an orderly machine of orbital dominance, now tore itself apart across 3 hemispheres. Ships spinning out of alignment, side frigates veering into each other, escape pods jettisoning in wrong directions. The Dominator's broken carcass still burned in low orbit, trailing fragments like a wounded predator leaking from every joint. Around it, the remaining warships staggered, void of orders, leadership, or control. Inside Reykjavik Command, no one cheered. Van stood at the center of the platform, helmet under his arm, lips pressed into a single, unreadable line. He watched the feed until his reflection disappeared beneath ash-colored static. "They've lost the chain," Vaughn confirmed beside him. "Tactical sync is down across sectors, defensive shells misfiring. Their entire assault grid is fracturing by the minute." Dross stepped up from the lower deck, sweat still rolling off his jaw despite the freezing vents. "Then we hit them now, before they patch any of it back together." Van didn't nod. He simply walked to the ops wall, drew a new trajectory across the northern sky belt, and whispered a directive to the relay officer behind the screen. Within 6 minutes, 12 strike wings launched from subterranean runways beneath the Swiss plateau, the Sahara Basin, and the gutted highways of Nevada. Each wing flew with minimal guidance, most piloted by veterans whose eyes had memorized terrain from decades of survival. They weren't just flying into victory. They were flying to finish what had begun beneath their feet. The counteroffensive cut through the wreckage like flint across dry stone. In polar orbit, 2 Harach battlecruisers collided while rerouting from separate command chains. Neither recognized the other's broadcast protocols anymore. One of them folded in half after slamming into the shattered debris of a defunct solar array. The explosion lit up the clouds above Norway for 7 seconds. Over eastern Asia, a contingent of human fighters using stolen shielding patterns pierced the thinning flank and struck 3 communications relays in succession. The third collapsed with such force, its detonation scattered flickering hull pieces into the upper atmosphere. Beijing's night sky turned amber with falling debris. Below, the streets were quiet. Fires still smoldered in ruins left by early bombardments. The ash drifted slowly, sticking to rooftops and drifting into broken windows. Colonel Dross didn't wait for clearance. His gunship barreled through the breach near Cuba's lower orbital ring, charging straight into the engine core of a retreating Harach cruiser. The vessel's rear sensors were already malfunctioning. They never saw him coming. He slammed into its drive sector. The impact detonated the remaining fuel compartments instantly. There was no body, just a name logged with 3 words: made contact, logged purpose. Across the outer systems, comms lit up like a broken mosaic. Images of the Dominator's explosion, captured through every angle Earth's scattered satellites could still transmit, spread across the Orion sector's relay bands. Not as military reports, but as shared fragments. A fractured hull spinning through radiation bands. The dimming of its command beacon, the flickering collapse of its vent towers. In colonies enslaved by the Harach, silence turned to static, then static turned into sound. Cheers broke out on defected relay ships in the Dinvar spiral, entire networks long blacklisted by the Harach blinked back to life. Some with corrupted greetings, others just playing old Earth music recovered from intercepted data caches. One message scrolled across 100 translation layers. The beast can bleed. And yet, on Earth, no one was celebrating. Cities still burned. Flames twisted through high-rises in Johannesburg. In Shanghai, the skyline was skeletal, casting long shadows over streets littered with the remains of decoy systems and shattered defense batteries. Lagos's energy grid flickered from strike damage, struggling to route power to emergency stations as citizens carried stretchers down stairwells lit by broken signage. In Boston, a boy stood in the middle of what had once been a transit plaza, clutching a hand-drawn flag and staring at a drone wreck lodged into the side of an old museum. The world hadn't won clean. It had survived, barely. Salvage crews didn't wait for final confirmation. In Alaska, teams began tethering debris from a fallen scout ship lodged inside a frozen canyon. The wreckage was still hot, its surfaces glowing faintly with residual core damage. Technicians operated in shifts, welding scaffolds while their boots sank into thawing earth laced with chemical runoff. Near Lagos, a separate team hauled out a plasma shield fragment the size of a city bus, carving it into portable segments to transport it across fractured rail lines. Each piece would be studied, converted, reforged into something Earth could wield next time. Van watched them work from a ridgeline overlooking what had once been a township. It had no name anymore. What remained were craters. A road twisted into what looked like a helix. He stepped forward alone, boots crunching over gravel that had once been walls, roof tiles, family rooms. A rusted swing set lay bent in the dirt nearby, its frame torn open where heat had kissed metal and split it down the side. He didn't speak. Rundal stood behind him, not saying anything either. There was nothing to add. Nothing that could balance the cost against the win. After a long while, Van dropped to one knee, ran his hand along the dirt, and lifted a piece of scorched stone in his palm. No words, only breath and broken sky above. Later that night, the fleet reconfirmed what no one had said aloud yet. The Harach were retreating. Their remaining ships were coalescing toward the edge of Earth's orbital reach, aligning for jump vectors without coordination, fleeing without honor, surviving without vengeance. Their chain of command was severed, their legacy undone. But Earth didn't pursue. It watched. And in every shattered city, beneath every ash-laced streetlight, and behind every pair of wary eyes, people stood, not with cheers, but with silence sharpened by memory. The beacon went live 30 days after the last Harach cruiser vanished past Neptune's magnetic shadow. No music, no anthem, no human face or emblem. Just a 7-second transmission loop pulsed across every known starway channel, encoded into basic telemetry that even pre-warp species could read. Enter Earth's orbit again and you'll see what we do with warnings. It ran once every full orbital cycle unchanged. No responses were sent. None were received. Above Earth, low-orbit salvage tethers reeled in the fractured hulls of fallen drones and shattered frigates. Crews wore exosuits patched together from industrial mining gear and scavenged armor plates, shoulders marked not with ranks, but with initials of the dead. They didn't speak much. The silence, for many, was the only part that didn't feel stolen. The Dominator's remains drifted still, half spine, no command core. Its outer framework bristled with ruptured coolant coils, some still glowing in slow pulses from energy buried deep in the wreck. One of its cannons had torn off during atmospheric re-entry, carving a trench 50 kilometers across the ocean floor. No effort had been made to restore it. It was left visible, so anyone watching knew it hadn't been erased. It had been left to float. Van watched from the eastern launch tower in Greenland, one of the only orbital ascender rigs that hadn't collapsed during the early strikes. A maintenance crew hovered above the atmosphere line, carving new names into the ring's inner bulkhead. They weren't alphabetical, they were listed by coordinates, where they were when they fell. "Anyone you know?" asked Rundal, who stood with arms crossed, his sleeve pinned where his forearm used to be. Van didn't answer, his gaze stayed fixed on the wall. "Mine Sector 32K, Rune said after a pause. He was inside one of the fake hospitals we planted as a decoy. Stayed to guide in the second evac wave. The ship pulled him through, but clipped a tower fragment and ripped him out the hull." Still nothing from Van. But when a technician asked where the final panel should go, next to Cairo's burn trace or Lagos's perimeter breach, Van pointed silently to a section directly beneath the orbital grid's last reinforcement beam. There, scorched black by impact marks, the beam had twisted. Not enough to threaten the structure, but enough to remember the hit. The panel was bolted in, no ceremony, no applause. Just one more mark in the sky. Elsewhere, news of the Dominator's destruction spread beyond human channels. The Adjourneth broadcast fragments to Allied systems, stitching together their escape footage with intercepted Harach collapse orders. Independent clusters across the Lyric's arm shared decrypted images of the flagship's fall. Frames slowed to document each frame, where the central array dimmed, spark by spark, until its shape broke apart entirely. Inside the Varn Collective's central dome, young recruits were forced to study the sequence as part of newly updated threat protocol training. No longer categorized as Terran neutral, Earth's species was now listed under a single-word classification: unpredicted. The Harach themselves fractured further. Dozens of minor vassal territories erupted in revolt. On Earth Prime, Harach command centers were sacked by those they once ruled through fear. On Zalon 3, former supply workers forced open security vaults and disabled orbital tethers to prevent recall. Internal conflict ignited across their rear sectors. Supply ships no longer reached frontline colonies. Elite war advisors were found dead. Systems locked from within. The Empire still breathed. But it breathed shallow. On Earth, there were no parades, no medals distributed, no global broadcast or slogan printed. Instead, cratered cities received memory fields. Rows of blackened stone slabs, some carved, most blank. Burned-out courthouses served as temporary housing hubs. Schools were rebuilt with triple-reinforced walls and escape elevators. No one called them shelters, but everyone knew what they were. In Montana, a man returned to his orchard and found only soil. He planted again anyway. In Sudan, children drew chalk outlines on broken roadways that no longer led to towns. In Berlin, old subway tunnels became living quarters, and the laughter there echoed off soot-marked walls. Van returned home once, or what was left of it. The valley was gone, replaced by a long scar of fused rock and tangled beams. One of the Dominator's deflector cannons had clipped the hillside during its descent. The blast buried 3 neighborhoods under glassy rubble. He walked the edge of the crater and stopped near a bent signpost. His name had once been etched into the wall of a fire station there, years before he left for the asteroid drills. Now there was nothing but scrap. He sat, didn't speak. The move. Just watched the salvage birds pull their cables overhead, collecting shattered parts of something that thought itself eternal. Years later, far from Earth, a young cadet at the Vornan War Academy reviewed a decrypted archive logged from the final Earth-Harach encounter. The data stream was incomplete, recovered from a derelict listening post that caught the universal beacon loop, mid-secle. He tapped the console, played the transmission again. Enter Earth's orbit again, and you'll see what we do with warnings. Behind him, his mentor, a decorated tactician from the Ferrix Wars, crossed the room slowly, eyes still sharp with memory. "Is that all they sent?" the cadet asked. The old soldier didn't respond immediately. He studied the fractured record, gaze narrowing as each line of Earth's war record scrolled past. Irregular attacks, unpredictable patterns, zero surrenders, adaptive countermeasures, misdirection buried in damage. What did they really do? The cadet pressed. The veteran finally spoke, voice low, worn. They spoke through wreckage. He turned toward the viewport, and the wreckage listened. Above Earth, the defense grid activated its new orbital array. It didn't fire, it didn't threaten. It just stayed ready. Below, teams continued working through ship fragments, burying the unusable, reusing the rest. Engineers passed tools to children who would grow up not fearing the sky, but understanding how to break it if needed. And in the distance, far beyond the clouds, salvage ships moved carefully past the Dominator's wreck and remained untouched. Not because they couldn't dismantle it, but because everyone watching needed to see what happened when Earth stopped waiting. What do you think Earth should do with the wreckage of the Dominator? Bury it as a warning, or build from it? Comment below, hit subscribe, and join us for more thrilling HFY stories.